another edition of the
Heavy
Metal
Citadel
Podcast.
Yeah, and today we have someone truly amazing. He is a wellspring of knowledge. His name is Dial Patterson. He's an author, photographer, and founder of Cult Never Dies, a publishing house and web store featuring all sorts of tasty and official band merch, like the Psy shirt that you'll see me wearing at every possible opportunity.
Yeah, it's literally worn out. Stop wearing it for the love of God or buy it.
Oh, yeah, no, it's the style. You got to get the smells from the shows. The man, like I said, is a fountain of knowledge, and we can't wait to be embarrassed as we struggle to remember the name of the third song off of Blaze in the Sky. Yes. But he has written numerous books, including Black Metal: The Evolution of the Cult, Black Metal: Into the Abyss, Owls, Trolls, and Dead King's Skulls, The Art of David Theory, and Non Serviam: The Official Story of Rotting Christ.
Hell yeah.
And he's done interviews with every possible black metal band known to man, even more than our 10 bands we've interviewed so far.
Yeah, but I'm going to ask him if he knows about a Papua New Guinean band.
No, that's true.
That?
Oh, it could be a good question. So we're grateful and very excited to have a chat with him today.
So yeah, here he is. Why don't you introduce yourself to the listeners?
Well, that was I can't compete with the intro that you just gave me, but yeah. I'm, as previously stated, I'm the founder of Cult Never Dies, and I was a writer and have been a writer sort of, I guess, about 2 decades, and started writing for magazines I started with a fanzine called Crypt, and then I started writing for Terrorizer and Metal Hammer and various other magazines, and then I did a book called Black Metal: Evolution of the Cult, which was released in 2013. And that was kind of the foundation for me to then go off into writing books and releasing books. And Cult Never Dies has grown from that release. Although that release was on Feral House, we were one of the main distributors and have basically grown from that point to publishing other people's work and releasing official merchandise and records and putting on gigs. So we're essentially an extreme and underground metal publishing house, but we also branch into promotions and merchandise and kind of a burgeoning record label as well at some smaller level. So we're quite busy.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Can you tell us a little bit more of your day-to-day, what it takes to run such a kind of comprehensive web store, publishing house, all of these things together?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few of us now. So I have, when I started doing this, I was doing everything. I was designing, writing, posting the items. And but as the years have gone on, I've taken on some employees, and now the web store is the mail order is essentially run by other people, and then that gives me time to focus on kind of creating new books. So my days tend to be filled with editing and designing new books. That's quite a big part of it. And I guess sort of overseeing the whole operation in terms of the direction of Cult Never Dies as a whole, really, what we focus on.
Okay. Wow. That's interesting as you say that, because I mean, I basically consider you like a historian of black metal at this point. And having said that, obviously that's exactly what you're right about. But do you think, for fans within sort of the community, should history be sort of a basic? You have to know the history of black metal before you really get into the music, or can you just sort of follow your heart to the music wherever it may go? Because I personally, for example, I think I got into black metal through thrash and then death and then black. I think that's how it went. So I wasn't driven by originally, like, obviously the background and the controversy and all the hell raising, but then once I started to hear it, I sort of really got into it. And even went to like DSBM and all these other subgenres too.
Exactly, because it's so wide. So do you think it's important that at the very least, all fans of black metal should know the history behind it?
I think ultimately, yes. I don't think anyone gets into a music, or it's unusual to get into a genre of music for anything other than it has to connect with you at some level. And I think when you start listening to extreme metal and black metal, obviously it has to has to interest you on a musical level before you would then go into looking into the sort of foundations and the history and all that. But I do think ultimately, I think if you're going to be involved in the black metal scene and be more than just a sort of a tourist or a casual listener, it's really important to understand where it came from. And I think if you weren't there in the 90s, it can be quite hard to know black metal, especially because of the way the internet works. It can be quite hard to know kind of really where things did come from and what the meaning of things are. So I think from my perspective, at least, I think it's important to know about the history of where you come from and kind of the culture of black metal, the history, the art, the sort of lineage of records and lineage of musicians, and that would be the way I would approach anything that I'm interested in. So
Yeah.
I can see that fortunately, underground metal tends not to have so many casual participants as some other genres of music. But I do recognize, obviously, not everyone is going to read books, or especially in the sort of the way that the internet fragments fan bases, and people can just discover stuff on YouTube and not really have a context for it. That I recognize that that's sort of realistic, that some people will stay like that. But I think in general, black and underground metal is a culture that sort of respects the past and as much as sort of the future and where things are going. It does look to it's not all about what's hot this month or what the newest band is. It's there's always been that respect for kind of the older artists, and it is encouraging to see that young fans are into bands like Mayhem or Hellhammer, or right back to Venom or Black Sabbath. I do think it's that is part of metal culture, really, to sort of celebrate the heritage of it as much as kind of what's pioneering right now.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that, just because I mean we live in a social media age, so I mean it's a lot easier to get access to these underground sort of black metal bands than it was 10, 15 years ago, where you had to order cassettes and wait for them to come in the mail. So I'm curious, I mean, do you consider yourself today, because there are so many people kind of dipping into the genre because it's cool or just because it's extreme, but they don't actually listen to it, they just buy like a t-shirt. Do you consider yourself more like a gatekeeper now then, with all this knowledge, or are you more like the celestial observer from beyond, just giving the facts to sort of the true black hearts?
I mean, the gatekeeping label has become a really sort of hot phrase in metal culture in the last sort of 2-3 years.
Yeah, indeed.
And mostly, I think it's kind of the lament of the people who didn't get into the, sort of aren't allowed in the gang. In a way, I always think it's a bit of a false accusation. It's sort of, to me, usually people label people gatekeepers because they're too lazy to sort of get any knowledge of something. I don't relate to that, because if I was getting into anything new, I'm interested in hip hop, but I wouldn't go and sort of, if I got into hip hop in the 90s through bands like Public Enemy, but I then looked into what these bands were about and what different, I wouldn't have walked straight into sort of a hip hop forum or a club and said, well, actually, all the stuff you're saying is rubbish. I know what's going on, and this is how it is. Which is kind of what there is, a sort of generation of black metal fans who have sort of attempted to co-opt, I think, what black metal is about. So I wouldn't say, I wouldn't say it's not an overly elitist position. It's especially that first book was kind of written for people who were interested and people who've been involved for a long time. So I'm definitely not, in that sense, I'd say I'm definitely not sort of looking for us to be a gatekeeper, and it's not overly elitist. But at the same time, there is a sort of, there is a history and a culture, which is, whether people like the events or like how things are, but that is how it is. And you can't, I have seen in the last few years people coming in and just sort of saying, well, I've been into black metal 6 months and I consider this band black metal, and if you don't agree, you're a gatekeeper and you're elitist. And there's a lot of that in metal, not just black metal actually, but it's partly fueled by ridiculous publications and online sites and so on. But it's become sort of a buzzword for people who feel that whatever they believe ought to be accepted. If you walk into black metal and say, well, black metal is all about peace and love and whatever else, then you sort of have to. Somebody is it's fair enough if somebody corrects you. You can't then sort of say, well, you'll be an elitist. And I do remember there was a discussion. There was a discussion in a group, and I was asked some opinions. And there was someone there's someone who'd basically been into black metal, I guess, for about a year, and was claiming that certain others of us were elitist and gatekeepers for not allowing Alcest, Merca, Death Heaven, Ghost Bath, and a few other bands, for saying that isn't black metal, it's black metal inspired music. That was sort of that was labeled as gatekeeping and elitist, and I find that really a sort of really arrogant perspective. And I do find there's a lot of that in the sort of online crusading world, where people are sort of attempting to sort of imprint their own values onto it. We don't have to like history, but you do have to recognize it. And I don't have to agree with every black metal band, but if they've said something in the past and you've come along 10 years later, you can't sort of claim, well, those people were not really black metal, we're now black metal or whatever.
You're right. There is that revisionism.
Yeah, a lot of revisionism, and there's a lot of that in the last few years. I think as black metal's really exploded into a different demographics, and there's a problematic element of that, I think. So I do feel in a way like these books, to some extent, they're about setting the record straight, and also it's very important that they're written from within the genre rather. And most books on black metal, most articles, most films, they're people from outside of black metal looking in and essentially distorting what black metal is about and distorting the history of it. And I think that's, that was the motive for writing that first book. There were so many people doing that at the end of the 2000s, and there's sort of another wave of that now. That I felt like it was important for somebody to sort of speak to the artists themselves and kind of get the story straight from the source, rather than sort of, create all these hypotheses and academic interpretations, or tabloid interpretations, both are as bad as each other, really, and then sort of imprinting that onto what black metal is.
Yeah, of course. The more dramatic stories being told, like, through Lords of Chaos, which I think came out, was 97, 98, something like that.
Yeah.
With the book. And obviously yours, it's a little bit more about the music themselves and the artist's, I guess, interpretation of the events as well. But I'm wondering, how did you choose who to talk to? I mean, besides the very obvious bands that had a shaping of the scene, but how did you choose who to talk to, and how do you map that out on a timeline?
Well, it really was about mapping it on a timeline. And I tried to go, I've been into black metal since the mid-90s, but I tried to go in a little bit as a historian would, and sort of not taking too much assumptions about where things have come from. So a lot of it was about talking to bands basically who influenced you, and really getting that, that kind of path of influence from the start. Speak to a band from Norway who came out in '92, and they tell you, well, we were really inspired by Bathory and Volcano. Then it makes sense to write a chapter about Bathory and interview somebody from that, and speak to Volcano. And it kind of went from that, really. A lot of it was to do with plotting out kind of the timeline and not getting too bogged down in, I guess, kind of, again, hypotheticals. A lot of black metal articles, they tend to, well, there's two things. Firstly, they tend to talk about things like Coven, or they'll go to, sorry?
Was that the late 60s, this band with
Yeah,
the
yeah. I
black
mean,
mask on the album?
absolutely, and a great band, but nothing to do with black metal, and really good.
Exactly. It's just satanic. There's no like musical connection at all, really.
Exactly, and yeah, there's sort of a temptation to like look at that sort of thing, and then the other thing is that in other books and films and so on, what I found was that a lot of the time the 80s black metal was essentially rushed over because the people wanted to really look at the more sort of sensational 90s stuff. So there'd be sort of a brief mention of bands like Bathory and Hellhammer, and if you were lucky, maybe something like Master's Hammer. But then it would really present that as being sort of like a sort of superficial early attempt, and then the 90s got it right, that kind of attitude. So the first third of Evolution of the Cult is big interviews with bands like Blasphemy, Volcano, Venom, Hellhammer, Rotting Christ. The first lineup of Mayhem, so looking at the sort of 80s years, and Vaughn, and so really taken more seriously kind of the musical lineage of it. The fact that so many Norwegian bands would say we loved Master's Hammer and they were part of the reason we used keyboards in black metal, then it makes sense to really, I mean, apart from the fact that Master's Hammer is a fantastic band, it makes sense for people to know about Master's Hammer and to see that it wasn't just sort of out of the blue that bands like Enslaved and Emperor started putting synth into black metal. I guess it's all, a lot of it's to do with sort of where do things come from. And so, that was a big part of it. And as you said, it was a sort of plotting out a timeline. So Evolution of the Cult, the later books are less about that, but the first book was really looking at everything in a kind of chronological way. So
interesting. And because you mentioned Rotting Christ just now, I am curious because you wrote the story. I mean, how did you get in touch with them? And I mean, these bigger bands. I mean, I've left them several voicemails and they haven't received them. But is it mostly just sort of building that repertoire of obviously covering these major bands, and then sort of word of mouth spreads, and that's how you sort of get in touch with them, and they're the ones who are willing to sort of share their story with you?
I mean, Rotting Christ were friends, so that one was kind of a lot of the bands were friends at some level, so that sort of made things easier. But the first book was definitely more difficult than, I mean, Rotting Christ, that book was written, we released at the end of 2016. I think we probably started writing it, 2013, maybe 2014. So at that point, I'd already done a chapter with them I'd already interviewed them for Evolution of the Cult. We'd done a T-shirt together. We'd done a hoodie together. I might even have interviewed them for Metal Hammer. So there was kind of, by that point, we knew each other. But definitely when I did the first book, I didn't know all those bands. And so there was a lot more. It took 4 years to do Evolution of the Cult. And part of that was kind of, trying to give potential interviewees a picture of what the book was going to be like. Once you've done one book, it's quite, when I did the sequel, it was very easy because I just say, here's a copy of Evolution of the Cult. This is the sequel, and most people liked Evolution of the Cult, so it made it much easier. But with the first book, it was often people I'd either interviewed for my fanzine, or people I'd interviewed perhaps for Terrorizer. And then it was like friends of friends. So, I wanted to, I'd never dealt with the guy from Snore from Thorns. But I knew some of his friends, from other bands quite well. So it was always like that. Again, Mysticum, they were friends, so I could get them to kind of put in a word for me with, another band that was Norwegian, but maybe I didn't know so well. And a lot of it was just, sort of networking, or at least just trying to get that kind of personal connection, and really spelling out what the book was going to be and what it wasn't going to be, because there was a lot of people who they didn't want to be involved in the first book necessarily because they were suspicious about how black metal was covered by writers in the media and so on.
I see. Yeah, of course. Yeah, I imagine you as kind of like a mad detective with your cork board and the string and plotting out every single part of the story. It's really interesting. And You just mentioned the band, Mysticum, and
Yes.
you also named, Black Lodge album as one of your top black metal albums of all time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in terms of industrial black metal, it's a subgenre that honestly we're not really familiar with, and it's great that you're shedding light on these tons of different subgenres and a wide array of what black metal is. Obviously, you do merch with Dotham's Guard as well. Can you tell us maybe a little bit more about industrial black metal?
I feel like the way that evolution of the cult gives, when I look back at it, I think the first 2/3 are, as I would extend those chapters, but they're more or less as they should be.
Mhm.
The last third of it, that book was released with Feral House, and I was given a word count, which is fair enough.
Yes.
But there was a point where I had to stop writing, and I think it might look a little bit like I'd highlighted industrial black metal as being a particularly important vein of black metal, where it's for me in the last third of the book, it became less important about sort of, I guess, which bands were included, because I already knew there was going to be a sequel at that point. So the first sequel has bands like Satyricon, who weren't in depth featured in Evolution, and you also have a huge section on DSBM, Polish black metal. So yeah, I suppose the first thing I'd say is that industrial black metal is not that broad a genre, and I did mention kind of three of the best bands, which was Black Lodge, Mysticum, and Aborum. So I mean, it is a subgenre that I really like, but possibly if you just read Evolution and you didn't read the three sequels, it might seem a little bit like, I've seen a lot of reviews where people were saying, "Oh, I didn't know industrial black metal was such an important thing."
Exactly.
Possibly this distorted slightly, but all those bands were definitely worth including. I mean, Mysticum were really a massively significant band, and part of the reason I included Black Lodge was not just because of their music, but because of the sort of the depth of the ideology. There weren't many bands whose albums were as thought out in terms of concept and religious faith, I guess. So, some of the bands that were featured, it was more like highlighting certain aspects of where things went. And again, Dodheim's Guard, they've gone all over the place with their music, and they're really experimental and important bands. So they really were an important band in industrial black metal, but they came from something that was not industrial black metal, and they've gone into something which is a different sort of black metal again. So yes, nice. I do think it's important.
We'll pop some links in there. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention that, just because I have a rather weird fixation with another unique artist in a subgenre, DSBM, Natram and Silencer. I don't think there's been a 2-episode gap where for some reason I haven't mentioned Natram and Silencer.
Oh,
but no, when I first heard Sterile Isn't That About, I was literally like, my whole fucking day was about that song. Right. And given that I have a black metal guru in front of me, I'm going to ask you, do you know who the real Natram is? Because I've done my research. I've looked up all the names. People have debunked various theories. And I know there's a mythology around him, like putting on pig's hoofs. And there's the whole incident with the axe and the child, which from what I've read is apparently his brother. But I'm curious to know, do you know if there is a real Natram, or if it's now just become this mythology that's perpetrated by, I don't know, imposters?
Yeah, well, he's a real guy. I mean, that book, you mentioned the David Thierry book I did, and he was originally going to do the cover for the Silencer album because he knew Natram.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't such a, he wasn't such a far out. A lot of his stuff is mythology. He wasn't such a far out character back in those early days. He was just another guy with a black metal band. But the second book that we did has a whole chapter on Silencer, and it's the only interview I think that was ever done with. I think there's been one since, but it was the only interview at the time that was ever done with Leah, who wrote all the music for Silencer. And I think Silencer, Natram gets a little bit. He did the vocals, but he didn't write any of the music, or it was a 2-piece. and
Yes.
it was Leah that founded the band. But yeah, I've seen some photos of Natram today, and he's
Living his best life.
On the
well, I
beach.
don't know about that. I don't know enough about that.
Yeah.
But I've seen photos of him because I mean, he was. It's not that hard to see early photos of him before. I think that one photo shoot was genius, really, with the face
Pig
covered up,
hooks.
the pig trotters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's obviously he didn't really. I mean, I think 99% he didn't. So he's obviously holding them. It's a photo shoot.
Yeah,
I think it's one of these. It's almost like a creepypasta sort of post-millennial sort of urban legend,
like Slender Man. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, and he's still making music. He still does industrial or dark ambient, whatever you want to call it. So he's still out there. And Leah turned up later. Sorry, in Shine and some other bands. So,
Oh yeah,
there was kind of a connection to. But yeah, that was a band I really wanted to feature for the first sequel. And again, if Evolution of the Cult had an unlimited number of pages, they probably would have been the first book. But at a certain point, I realized I was kind of running out of space, and it would just become a series of books. And that series has become a little bit delayed at this point because I've now, Cult Never Dies is so much about releasing other people's books. The last book that I released was the Rotten Christ book, which is 6 years ago.
Wow.
So so now it's more about being a publishing house rather than being a writer, I guess. Or Cult Never Dies started off, the first 4 books we released were basically my books. It was essentially a means of an end to kind of distribute my own publications or publish my own, distribute my own publications without any sort of interference. But at this point, there's I think there's 18 authors.
Yeah, you have a ton of stuff on there.
Yeah.
Is there something you recommend? I mean, outside of your own books, of course, which are great, but is there anything else that you'd recommend from the things that you've put out, black metal or not? What would you highlight?
Well, for people who are interested in doom metal, I think we published the 2 sort of definitive doom metal books, which are the Doom Metal Lexiconum 1 and 2, which is by an author called Alexei Evdokimov. So that's obviously, it's quite niche. Doom metal itself is obviously quite niche, but they're huge encyclopedias. Each one is sort of 300,000 words, and there's a third one on its way. So it's well into 1 million words, kind of covering the history of doom metal. Rotten Ways to Misery is a really fantastic book about the history of Finnish death metal. It's by 2 Finnish authors, and that's actually one of our biggest selling books, which is a bit of a surprise, really.
Yeah, it is.
So that's really good. The Peaceville Life biography is very good. That's written by Hammy, who is the founder of Peaceville Records and has interviews as well. It's essentially his life story, but it has interviews with the guys from Autopsy and At the Gates and Dark Throne, Paradise Lost. So yeah, there's that's another one. The Rotting Christ book is one of the books I'm most proud of sort of writing, and creating. So I'd have to put that in there.
Yeah.
Trying to think what else we've done. We've also obviously released a lot of fanzine anthologies, and I think those really that's almost like sort of first-hand evidence of. It's one thing to write about black metal and death metal scenes now and to talk about what happened in the 90s, but I think one of the things I'm quite happy with Cult Never Dies is that we regularly release these anthologies of old fanzines, and you're really getting it from the it's almost like evidence. The interviews the bands did when they were much younger in those eras. It's very different to the sort of interviews you would get now, and I think there's something very interesting about that because there's the scene was a lot more chaotic and extreme, and bands like Emperor weren't sort of respectable household names. They were bands on the edge of on the fringes of sort of normality, I guess. Multiple members in prison, and a lot of those interviews with black metal bands and the fans in the 90s fanzines, people are very much believing in the supernatural or believing in Satanism and fighting the good fight, and there's some. I think there's a lot to be said about talking to these people now. They've got broader perspective. But it's also interesting to look at those books of fanzine reprints and kind of see what the mindset was then, because it's so different, obviously, to the way it is now. So we've published books like Skogan. We reprinted Skogan, Dead Sea.
Yeah, we bought that one. I've read it numerous times over. It's fucking
Excellent,
brilliant.
Well, the Dead Sea was actually one of the zines that inspired me to start writing. And it was, I used to see the guy selling it outside of gigs in the 90s when I was still basically at school. And I was quite, I thought that's really interesting to sort of do your own magazine. And that's sort of one of the places the idea came from, to sort of do this whole self-publishing, I guess. Whereas now I can't call it self-publishing, but it started with self-publishing fanzine, and it's become I guess at this point we're a legitimate, we're a legitimate publishing house. We've just released a book, The Official Story of Paradise Lost, which is obviously a much bigger band and much more kind of, I guess, accessible. The bigger fan base and broader listenership, and so we've kind of, that's important as well for us to have that sort of. To cover the bigger bands and to cover the really obscure stuff, and to kind of highlight the links between it all, really, rather than just being, there's a lot of publications that just focus on the mainstream. There's quite a few publications that just focus on the underground, but there's obviously a lineage again from like a band like Paradise Lost, who were very extreme in their early days and inspired a lot of the bands that were then in our doom metal lexicana, or it maybe interviewed bands that appeared in some of the fanzines that we reprinted. And it's all about drawing those kind of, like you said, with the cork board and the pins and the string. It's like there's so much connections within metal music, and I think that's a big part of what fascinates us, really. And I have to say that's a big part of books like Evolution was you talk to one guy and he mentions another band, and then you draw those connections, and I think that's kind of a pivotal part of what metal's about.
So I just wanted to touch on one thing. You'd mentioned Skogan, and we have. I recently got it for a birthday present, I believe, from you, Chernobyl. So thank you, buddy. Thank you for that.
Only the best from my buddy.
Only the best. I was delighted because it really had some of those sort of early bands, and when they were really starting out. I think it was 1993 to 1996, if I'm not mistaken. And that was you and Sasha Borov-Kanin, if I'm not mistaken. And I don't even know where he's from, but he sounds highly Eastern European.
Yeah, it's more him than me, really. I did the new text, but he was the original editor and creator.
Yeah, and I did want to say there. I mean, there were some, because it's the first sort of early years of the second wave, and it's bands finding sort of their sound and the identity. Sort of the second wave, and there are some hilarious responses to the questions in there. And I forget who it was. I might be mistaken that it's Mortis, but I know someone. I think Sasha was saying I had a lot more questions to ask, but he lost a piece of paper that had all the answers to them, and it was just these like hilarious little things. Which again, it's short. Like you look at it now, and with fresh eyes, obviously, it looks a lot different. And you look at bands today and sort of some of the interviews they've had and the responses that they have. Do you think in like 25 years from now, the content that we see today is going to maybe have the same sort of feeling to it?
I think one of the big differences is one of the interesting things in black metal, again, if you compare it to hip hop or rock even, is that the average successful band or artist is quite a bit older these days than most of the, when I look at, as I say, dance or hip hop or rock, or of course you have the big names, you have the Rolling Stones or the Guns N' Roses or the Jay-Z's or whatever it happens to be. But there's definitely a leaning towards who's young and new, like what is, the biggest name. If you were to take the biggest name in hip hop right now, it's probably going to be somebody in their 20s or 30s, probably in their 20s.
Kendrick Lamar.
No, Chance the Rapper.
Oh.
That's what Chris from Ahab said.
Okay.
They're gonna be, I don't know who the biggest rapper is right now, but I'm sure it's, a lot of these guys like Chief Keef and all those kind of guys at their peak, they're in their 20s, or some of them are teenagers.
Yeah.
And if you look at, mainstream rock, the bands that, let's say, teenage rock, emo, punk, whatever you want to call it, fans, they tend to go for, bands that are in their 20s, because they kind of relate to that, and they're more accessible and marketable. And pop music's another example. But if you look at black metal, if you were to look at the biggest bands, you'd have to say, Mayhem, those guys are mostly around 50. Burzum, he's obviously around this. Burzum and Dark Throne, they're mid to late 40s. Even a band like Maguire, who are kind of, the new wave, or to some extent, they were like another wave. Those guys are sort of mid to late 30s. So because of that, I think the stuff that's going on in the 2000s in black metal is a little bit less sensational, because you're not dealing with such young people. The 90s, most of the black metal artists and death metal artists were late teens, early 20s.
I guess it's that expression of youth, and this kind of new kind of forbidden genre, more than it was more, like these days, so accessible with social media and everything. Back then, it was probably more tight knit and more true to that extent, a little bit more dangerous than it is now.
Absolutely. Yeah, because we, back then we didn't know that black metal and extreme metal and heavy metal as a genre was going to become so big and last so long. So I think the attitudes you saw displayed were much more fiery and sort of less thinking about the consequences, because I'm sure none of these bands thought that in 2020 they'd be still around and people would still be listening. And so I think that's different. I think that's one of the different things that, when we look back at let's say the 2020s or the 2010s in black metal, most of the artists were in their 30s or above, the important artists. And there aren't that many, there are, of course, loads of young bands, but there's very few young, important bands. I know that's a bit disparaging. I don't want to sound older than my years by saying that, but if you were to take the top 10 most important black metal bands in 2022, there's not going to be any teenagers there, and there might not even be anyone in their 20s there. But if you took the top 10 black metal artists in 1992, a lot of them were like, Emperor famously, Ishan was sort of 15. When they first started doing demos, and there's, that's just one of many examples. People were a lot younger. So, I think things now are a bit, things have evolved, and probably there's a bit more depth to the worldview, and a bit more maturity to the whole thing, and which is good in many ways. But it's interesting also to look back at those more uncensored and extreme, I guess, more extreme days.
Yeah, and it's becoming, from what I've seen at least, maybe even less important, like who the person is behind the music, whether they're old or young, or their political leanings, or what have you. It's like, many bands are masking themselves, or not creating any sort of idea of who they are, and just letting people focus on the music itself.
Yeah, and that was always sort of part of I think that was quite a big part of black metal, especially, less so death metal, because but even death metal, in a way, you can say, they had quite a normal, casual look, and they weren't presented
cargo shorts.
Yeah, exactly, and blue jeans, and I suppose if you look at a band like Morbid Angel in their peak, they were sort of presented almost, I don't mean this at all disparagingly, because they're a great band, but those early images, they're almost like Wasp or Guns N' Roses. They're almost like rock star, presenting them almost like rock stars.
Yeah, Vincent's all done up with his hair.
And they, there's that famous image of them with the girls underneath, and it just looks, it's almost like Man of War, that sort of very over the top, or Bathory, I suppose you could, something like that. But black metal, it was more about anonymity, and whether it's corpse paint or masks, it's a little bit less about the personalities. But there's also that contradiction, because the worldviews and the opinions given are very individualistic. So there's always been that kind of weird paradox.
It is a weird paradox, isn't it? It's not about the person, but it's also about in some bands, being larger than life, and it's more about the character and the mythology, of who the band is, rather than the
there
people.
is an element of mythology to it. And I think Batushka was a good example of that, but it was also an example of how you can't really or Ghost, if you wanted to go to an extreme. Ghost is more pop rock or whatever, but it's the same thing. You can't stay anonymous in the same way you could in the 90s. You're asking about Natram, and if you're looking at bands like the Black Legions, some of those guys, and some of those 90s black metal bands, the members are still anonymous today because all you had was a few photocopied black and white photos, and it was quite easy to stay anonymous. But in an internet age, it's almost impossible. And as I say, that you can see that with Batushka. That was part of their big thing, was who are these people? But eventually that became known. Ghost
completely unraveled.
Completely
yeah.
unraveled.
It's almost impossible now. I suppose Kiss would be a good example. If Kiss had come out in this, in an internet, social media, YouTube age, they probably wouldn't have taken so many albums to unmask, because it's just, it's a different world. It's the whole framework of communication and culture in rock and metal is different now. It's just everything's accessible all the time.
Yeah. No, it's funny that you mentioned Batushka, just because I was going to ask sort of your opinion on what role you think social media plays in today's sort of black metal scene. Just because what happened to Batushka is like, holy fuck, is that ever a story? And now there's
it's so public. Everything's so public what they do, and it's unraveled on social media as well. But it's also gaining popularity through social media.
Yeah, and I mean, you've got two Batushkas now, and they're both still. I mean, yeah, they're still doing shows and they're still producing music, and there's still this ongoing feud and shit like that, because I feel like it's just gonna keep happening.
Yeah, I mean, that's the world we live in. You can't really, remove yourself from it. The black metal and underground metal of all flavors kind of has an uneasy or complicated relationship with the internet and social media, I think, because it's definitely far less compatible with it than, say, pop music or rock music, or something with an ethos of pushing out to the broader world, or electronic, dance music and electronic music. There's obviously, it just sits much more comfortably within that framework, whereas black metal is supposed to be about anonymity and sort of being in the shadows. And obviously, in a sense, social media and the internet is the opposite of that. But at the same time, unless you want to be a complete Luddite and sort of, really make a point of not being connected at all to the internet and to that world, that's almost more contrived. I think most bands realize you have to use the tools that you're given. And, the great thing with the internet is it does allow people to reach. If you have a specialist interest, it allows you to connect with that interest, that culture, other people with the same interest.
Of course.
And the same with our books. I think probably if we were releasing books before the Kindle and internet age, we'd probably have higher sales on the successful books. But maybe the more niche books would have struggled more than they do now, because we wouldn't be able to reach all the people that are potentially interested in reading them. So the internet, we all deal with it. It's very hard to find anyone who, as much as they might pretend, they're not involved. And I know quite a few big black metal bands who publicly aren't on Facebook, but they have their secret account with 6 friends, and
it's part of everyday life, isn't it?
Yeah, you have to. You have to have that. So I think it's just how you deal with it, and there's definitely good ways and bad ways of working with promotions and the internet. And we have seen some bands who sort of make a fool of themselves and maybe expose themselves too much. And I think that's the unfortunate side of it.
It's got to be a careful curation of who you are. So
absolutely,
no drunk pics from the party the other night, or depending on what kind of party.
I mean, some bands get away with that, but if you're going to be, it wouldn't be so great if we saw. I'm trying to think of a good example here, but there are some bands, obviously, where the mystery of the you know.
You don't want to go see them shopping or taking a photo of their food at the restaurant.
No, I don't want to see a photo. I mean, as a fan of Silencer, you probably don't want to see a photo of Natram eating McDonald's and posting.
I mean, that would just send me down a wormhole of why he's there. So any photo really.
He really is a pig.
Helen Trotters. But
I think we're very lucky. You know, I think in black metal or just in metal in general that, you know, the fans still love the physical, you know, merch, the physical bits of the music representation. So obviously a big part of this is the fanzines. Of course, you started out, I think you said 2003.
Yeah.
It's been a long time since then. Do you think what do you think is the place of the fanzine in today's metal culture?
Well, the funny thing is that against the odds, the fanzine is much more popular now than it was 20 years ago when I was doing my fanzine. I mean, I did my fanzine really because I felt like nobody else was. I mean, that wasn't true, as it turns out. I found that there were a few, but you know, in the 90s, every gig you went to, there'd be at least 3 people selling their fanzine, and it seemed like such a creative, inspiring sort of part of the subculture. And then by about 2000, 2001, it was all about webzines, and people were really excited to have these kind of, you know, basic website, GeoCities and all that kind of stuff. So that was what I almost did my fanzine as a sort of tribute to a dead art, if you know what I mean. But in 2022, and partly because of Cult Never Dies, I would unmodestly say, the fanzine is quite a relatively healthy medium. And, you know, we sell quite a lot of fanzines by other, you know, we distribute fanzines for people, and we sell quite a lot of fanzines. We tend to, you know, we trade our books against them usually, and do it the old way. And but it is different now because I think perhaps a fanzine today is, in theory, the writing has to be better because there's more competition, and people could get, you know, back then it was about the only way you could read about certain bands was in fanzines, and now you probably could get that information on where, you know, online or somewhere else. So I think it's about making, same with our books, it's about making something that's superior to what you can read online. And you know, there's zines like Barter Methodology and that are written in a way that old fanzines wouldn't have been generally. There's less of a sort of there are a lot of old fanzines are quite scattershot and it was more about just soaking up the vibe. You know, you'd open the pages and you'd have all these crazy logos, and you know, the layout was much more uncommercial than reading, you know, Krang or Metal Hammer or something. You were clearly looking at something which was more impenetrable. And so it's a lot about soaking up the ambience. And I think fanzines are still a lot about that. They're more atmospheric than other publications. But as I say, now it's not. If you interview a band, it's unlikely that no one has ever read it or influenced, you know, or encountered that band, let's say, in some other way. So I think that maybe there's a bit more competition now in terms of making your zine stand out, just because there's more competition. Yeah.
Like podcasts.
Hey, now, come on, that's hitting close to home. There's no metal podcast. Shut up.
As good as this.
Okay. I was gonna ask them. I mean, if you're anything like us and anyone else, I guess, in the community, I mean, you're a merch head. You love to get merch. So I'm curious, what is your favorite piece of merch in the store?
It's really tough to choose. You know, so far we've only released merch that I only released stuff that I wanted to wear. So we haven't really gone as far down the merch line as I guess we could have. And that's partly because we still focus so much on publications, and also that we're now selling music and releasing music. So I've been quite lucky. Nothing we released was sort of for the sake of it, or of a band that I was only kind of, I thought this will sell and make money. It's never been like that, because we don't really have the pressures that you know, the big merchandise companies have, where it's just about moving units. So that's a bit of a lazy answer or a cheating answer. But I guess the ones that stand out for me would be the Samurai long sleeve.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. So the exact thing I own.
whatever.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I'm getting another one. I literally I
I
argued
think
with
he
them,
wants
but
one
yeah,
too.
it's cool.
And I
So we're
designed
gonna have
that was kind of that was nice because it's no one had done that with or the way the Japanese symbols or alphabet. What's the word?
Kanji?
Yeah,
Yeah, it's on the arm, right? Yeah, it's really great.
the way it's the way you have that was kind of something a bit different. What the way it had been done before is usually on like a back print or something. The Mysticum T-shirt and the Mysticum hoodie, especially for sort of just because that's one of my favorite bands, and the Mysticum hoodie with the Never Stop the Madness logo on the hood, I think it's quite a bold statement. And I also remember when we did Robin from the band was visiting my place in London, and I just remember when we were out at sort of 3 a.m. drinking, I just remember coming up with that idea and him scrabbling it down on the back of a napkin, basically. So it's kind of got that, there's a sort of sentimental link to it.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
And the
Like
Olva
you
as
said.
well. That's been a big thing. Sorry. I was just going to say the Olva, because we do all the old Olva designs, or the designs for the old Olva albums. I think that's nice as well, because that was a band that's, it's in the book, and it's a band that was important to black metal and we grew up with, and it's nice to sort of represent. That's obviously a band that's gone into a lot of different places and still makes great music, but in totally different genres. And
yeah, I'm still waiting for a hoodie for that third album, Felsanger, I think.
Oh yeah.
So I would love to have some sort of merch of that. Highly
hopefully we will do some more stuff. But yeah, it's nice to present something exclusive for a start, because we're the only people that do the stuff like that. But also to present it in a sort of sounds funny thing to say in a black metal context, but it's presented with a lot of love. Myself and Christopher, we talked a lot about what would be used. The back print is an old etching, which is exclusive to that, and we sort of well, it's not exclusive to that, but it's not been used in any other context with Olva or a band. And so it was none of it was rushed. It was all
have the blessing of the bands, which is great.
Yeah, not just the blessing though, more
collaboration, is it?
Yeah, exactly. And everything we do is pretty collaborative, and I think that's really important. All the books, the bands were collaborative. Sorry, they were collaborating rather than just being documented. And I think that was why Evolution of the Cult was embraced in a way that other black metal media wasn't, because all the bands had such a hands-on role. And that was why other books, that was why it was so easy to do sequels, and why Cult Never Dies in general sort of has been embraced by a lot of people that maybe wouldn't readily embrace other books or companies, or however you want to look at it. But we've always done everything with reverence, and I think that's actually rarer than you might think. I think there's a lot of people who are involved in the music industry and the music business who definitely are, enjoy black metal, and but there is an element of shifting units and covering, spreading themselves quite thin, and not to name names or anything, but we are quite niche, and we do sort of dig very deep into that niche, and hopefully
and we love you for it.
Thank you.
And because you do dig deep, and I mean, selfishly, I want to hear, you've done a ton of interviews in the past with a variety of different brands from every walk of life. What do you think makes for an interesting interview with a black metal band?
Probably what makes an interesting interview with anyone, and I suppose that's again, it sounds like a bit of a lazy answer, but I suppose you kind of need an interesting person to give an interesting interview. And I suppose the second thing is you then need that person to sort of be totally open and give as much as they're able. So you are always, I think that in a way that's why we're spoiled in black metal a bit, because I've met very few sort of nondescript characters in black metal. I didn't necessarily always like them or agree with them, but generally I got on with them, and generally they had something to say. And I used to interview a lot of bands for magazines, and occasionally you get a band that didn't really have anything to say, and you'd struggle to sort of make an interesting story about an album because it was just another album, and
We recorded it. It was cool.
yeah,
Thank you.
it's our best so far. We're not just saying that, and what's the meaning behind this song? Well, it's about some zombies, and I came up with that riff really late at night, and I really love it. And there's not much depth. There were a few bands I interviewed. Again, not to name names, but I do remember interviewing like a big deathcore band, and it was just like getting blood from because it wasn't terrible music or anything, but there was no meaning behind it. It was just it was just solid music for people that like that sort of music. And I don't think anyone in extreme metal really makes music without some sort of motivation beyond like just putting a good riff out. Especially in black metal and maybe doom metal, there tends to be, and underground death metal, there tends to be motivations that go way beyond that. Because nobody's making huge amounts of money playing this stuff. So you have to have a reason beyond just, making a hit or whatever. So in that sense, it's very different to some other music genres, which, you can make a living from, and your motivation might just be to make a song that people like. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but at the same time, you couldn't dig very deep into it and sort of look at the motivations and meanings behind the material. Whereas in black metal, there's always a worldview. That doom metal lexicon book, I didn't write it, so I can say this quite, without self-praising, but the authors managed to get a lot of motives about why people are writing maybe this melancholic music and kind of what bizarre books that inspired them or life events had given them this interest. And so I think, that's what makes it. I think what makes a good interview is someone interested who's willing to be interested and not guarded. And I think underground metal is excellent for that because people tend not to censor themselves so much, and they tend to be a little bit off the wall and a little bit not off the wall, but they're not your typical citizens. They usually have some different perspective.
Exactly.
That's the interesting part, really.
Yeah, and we want to thank you because I think you've also done just that for us. You've been incredibly insightful, super interesting, learned some new things, which I always love. And interviews.
Can I get your phone number? We can make like a WhatsApp group in case I have any questions day to night.
Oh, that'd be super useful. No, thank you, Dial. You have been fantastic. We now just want to close up, I guess, to say, check out Cult Never Dies.
Yep.
Amazing. Tons of great stuff, books, zines, anything you could want. Dial, is there anything you want to say to the listeners? Anything, any final words, or where else we should check out Cult Never Dies, or any other cool things that you've come across that you want to shout out about?
I'd give the obligatory plug, which is go to cultneverdies.myshopify.com or cultneverdies.com to check out more about all the books we do. There's not too much. Thank you for having me, of course. And we're doing we're quite involved in a festival in London for anyone who's based in the UK, Cosmic Void Festival.
Oh yeah,
we're gonna go to that. So
absolutely.
We just did. We just had one of our bands play Heathen Deity. We released their album last year. We've released the cassette version today, and they played Incineration Festival at the weekend just gone. And so we'll hopefully be doing some more work with them and another UK black metal band that is fast becoming one of the most important UK black metal bands. So we'll hopefully be announcing that in the next few weeks.
All right.
Very exciting. All right. Well, hopefully we'll see you then.
We'll see you at a show. Hopefully have a beer.
Beer's on us. That's the thank you.
Yeah, it's always good.
Yeah. And if there's anything else, Chord, any other final words from you?
Cult Never Dies.
Cult Never Dies.
Exclamation mark. Thank you so much, man. Thank you so much. And listeners, let's go ahead. Let's buy some sick ass merch. Let's support the community. And let's go from there.
Cheers, Dale.
Fantastic. Thank you.